understand how they could do this to me. How could they? I really trusted them.
How many times have we said those exact words about someone we trusted after being betrayed when we least expected it? One day, a woman came to Carl Jung with tears in her eyes, repeating those very same words. Still in shock, she couldn't understand how someone she trusted so deeply could betray her. But Jung saw something deeper behind her pain. Her suffering wasn't coming only from the betrayal itself. It was also coming from the collapse of the image she had created of that person. The person she thought she knew suddenly no longer existed. Once you begin seeing people this way, something changes in the way you understand relationships. You become less impressed by what someone says about themselves and more interested in what keeps repeating in their behavior. Anyone can be generous once. Anyone can apologize beautifully. Anyone can promise loyalty when nothing is testing that loyalty. What tells you far more about a person is what they continue doing when they are frustrated, jealous, rejected, embarrassed, or no longer getting what they want. This is where patterns become more revealing than promises. You may notice that someone becomes unusually affectionate whenever they sense you becoming distant, but slowly loses interest once they feel secure again. And sometimes the clearest information appears when you finally say no. A person can seem incredibly understanding for years while you are accommodating them, but introduce one boundary, disagree with them, or stop making yourself constantly available, and suddenly you meet a side of them you had never seen before. The boundary didn't create that side of them. It simply gave it a reason to appear. This is why constantly being kind without protecting your limits can create a strange dynamic. What begins as generosity can slowly become expectation, and what was once appreciated can eventually be treated as something you owe. You answer every call, so your availability becomes normal. You forgive every insult, so your forgiveness becomes expected. You keep giving people another chance, and eventually they stop believing there will ever be a consequence for hurting you. Then one day, when you finally withdraw that access, they may accuse you of changing. In reality, what changed was the arrangement. You stopped participating in a version of the relationship that worked very well for them. You can see versions of this dynamic almost everywhere, even from a young age. The person who rarely defends themselves is often tested more than the person who immediately pushes back. The student who desperately wants everyone to like them can become easier to pressure, while someone who is comfortable with disapproval is often treated more carefully. It isn't because people consciously sit down and decide who deserves respect. Much of social behavior happens without that level of thought. Human beings constantly read one another for confidence, acceptance, rejection, status, vulnerability, and belonging. We adjust ourselves according to what we sense we can gain, what we might lose, and what behavior the other person is willing to tolerate. This becomes even more interesting when we return to Jung. One of his most important ideas was that the qualities we refuse to recognize in ourselves often become easier to notice in other people. A person who cannot tolerate their own insecurity may become obsessed with pointing out insecurity in everyone else. Someone uncomfortable with their own need for attention may constantly accuse others of seeking it. This doesn't mean every accusation is projection, and it doesn't mean criticism is automatically hypocrisy. But sometimes the intensity of a person's reaction tells you that something deeper has been touched. Certain people disturb us far beyond what the situation seems to justify because they represent something we have not made peace with inside ourselves. And this is where observing human behavior becomes uncomfortable, because eventually you realize that people reveal themselves far more through repetition than through explanation. You don't need someone to admit that they compete with you when every piece of good news turns the conversation back toward them. You don't need someone to tell you that the relationship is one-sided when they repeatedly disappear during your difficult moments, and return whenever they need emotional support. The pattern has already spoken. But accepting that pattern can be difficult, especially when you love the person involved. So the mind negotiates with reality. You tell yourself that they are stressed, that they had a difficult childhood, that they care about you in their own way, or that perhaps you are expecting too much. Sometimes compassion is appropriate, and understanding someone's wounds can explain a great deal about their behavior. But explanation and permission are not the same thing. Someone's past may explain why they hurt people, but it doesn't require you to continue standing close enough to be hurt by them. And eventually, you may have to ask yourself a much harder question. How many times have I called something a misunderstanding because admitting that it was disrespect would force me to make a decision I don't want to make? Because sometimes we are not confused about someone's behavior at all. We understand it perfectly. We simply don't like what that understanding would require us to do. There comes a point when explaining someone's behavior becomes more exhausting than simply accepting what their behavior has been showing you. For a long time, you may resist that moment, not because you are incapable of seeing what is happening, but because seeing it clearly would force you to reconsider the relationship itself. When you have invested years of trust, affection, memories, or hope into someone, the mind doesn't easily accept information that threatens all of it. It searches for explanations that allow the relationship to remain intact. You remember the good moments whenever something painful happens. You focus on their intentions instead of the effect of their actions. You convince yourself that the person you knew before is still there somewhere, and if you remain patient enough, eventually that version of them will return. This is one reason people can remain emotionally attached to relationships long after those relationships have stopped feeling safe, respectful, or mutual. Sometimes we aren't holding on to the person anymore. We are holding on to the history we have with them, and the possibility of who we still hope they might become. And hope can make reality surprisingly difficult to accept. You can spend months trying to understand behavior that you understood the first time it happened. You can analyze someone's tone, their distance, their inconsistency, and every small change in their behavior, hoping to discover an explanation that hurts less than the obvious one. Perhaps they simply don't value the relationship in the same way you do. Perhaps the respect you believed was mutual depended on you behaving a certain way. These possibilities are painful because they don't give the mind much to solve. There is no perfect conversation that can force another person to value you correctly. And there is no amount of analysis that can transform someone's repeated behavior into something it isn't. Eventually, awareness begins replacing explanation. And when that happens, relationships can change before anything has happened externally. A compliment feels different when it comes from someone who repeatedly competes with you. An apology feels different when you have heard the same apology after the same behavior 5 times. A declaration of love feels different when affection consistently disappears whenever you become inconvenient. The words may still sound beautiful. They simply no longer have the power they once had. This is often what people describe as becoming detached. But detachment doesn't always begin with anger or resentment. Sometimes it begins with understanding. You stop arguing with what is in front of you, and certain things become much easier to see. You begin noticing how much human interaction depends on unspoken agreements. Families have them, friendships have them, and relationships have them. Everyone knows who cannot tolerate criticism, who needs control, or who becomes uncomfortable when someone else receives attention. Yet these patterns can continue for years because everyone quietly adjusts around them. People learn what not to mention, which truths to soften, and when staying silent is easier than creating conflict. Eventually, the performance becomes so familiar that it simply feels normal. Then, one person stops participating. They begin speaking honestly, setting boundaries, and refusing to pretend everything is fine just to keep everyone comfortable. Strangely, they are often treated as though they created the tension, when all they really did was make something visible that was already there. This reveals something important. Harmony and honesty are not always the same thing. Sometimes what looks like peace is simply an agreement not to mention what everyone already knows. And once you become aware of this, you start noticing how differently people behave depending on who is around them. Someone may be respectful toward a person with influence, then dismissive toward someone they consider unimportant. Another may speak constantly about kindness while showing very little patience toward the people closest to them. But these contradictions aren't always deliberate. Human beings are remarkably good at creating explanations that protect the way they see themselves. Very few people consciously think of themselves as controlling, jealous, selfish, or manipulative. Instead, the mind gives uncomfortable behavior a more acceptable meaning. This connects directly to Jung's idea of the shadow. The qualities we refuse to recognize in ourselves don't disappear. They simply find ways to influence our behavior without being acknowledged. Someone can manipulate while genuinely believing they're helping. They can emotionally punish another person while believing they're protecting themselves, or repeatedly create conflict while remaining convinced that conflict simply follows them. This is why a person's self-image can sometimes hide more than their words reveal. Someone who needs to see themselves as the good person in every situation can reinterpret almost anything to preserve that identity. Criticism becomes an attack. People who leave become ungrateful, and consequences become evidence that they were mistreated. Eventually, you learn to look beyond explanations and pay attention to what someone's behavior consistently produces. Does every disagreement somehow end with you apologizing? Does every boundary turn into an argument? Do things you shared vulnerably somehow return during future conflicts? Sometimes the pattern tells you more than the explanation ever will. And this leads to an important question whenever a relationship repeatedly leaves you confused. What does this person consistently need me to feel, believe, or do? Some people need admiration to feel valuable, while others constantly need reassurance because uncertainty is difficult for them. This doesn't necessarily mean they're consciously using anyone. Often, they don't fully understand what they're doing themselves. But once you recognize these patterns, certain relationships begin looking different. What seemed like unconditional closeness may have depended on the role you were playing: the listener, the rescuer, the understanding one, or the person who always needed less so someone else could need more. As long as you stayed in that role, everything remained stable. But when you changed, the relationship changed with you. And sometimes, nothing reveals the true structure of a relationship faster than becoming someone it was never designed to accommodate. This becomes especially clear when your life begins to change. You become more confident, and someone who once seemed comfortable around you starts making comments that minimize your achievements. You become more independent, and the person who encouraged you begins questioning your choices. You stop needing constant reassurance, and someone who seemed deeply invested suddenly becomes distant. At first, this can be confusing. You expect people who care about you to celebrate your growth, and many genuinely will. But growth doesn't only change you, it changes the position you occupy in other people's lives. If a friendship was built around one person always giving advice and the other always needing it, what happens when no one needs to be rescued anymore? If a relationship depended on you seeking approval, what happens when you stop needing it? This is because relationships aren't built only around personalities. They're often built around roles. Someone becomes the responsible one, the emotional one, the listener, or the one who keeps everyone entertained. There is nothing wrong with this until your acceptance depends on continuing to perform that role. You may have spent years being the person who never complained, only to be called difficult the moment you finally express frustration. This is why growth can reveal things about relationships that ordinary life never exposes. You haven't necessarily become harder to love. You may simply have become harder to use in the same way. Sometimes people miss you, but what they actually miss is what you provided. Someone who always listened, forgave, reassured them, or made them feel important. That doesn't make every relationship selfish. Healthy relationships naturally involve giving, receiving, supporting, and depending on each other. The problem begins when the connection only works while that exchange remains unequal. You say no, and affection becomes guilt. You ask for space, and concern becomes accusation. You stop chasing someone, and suddenly their interest returns. You succeed, and their encouragement becomes strangely quiet. These reactions can reveal what your old role was providing for them. So when you change, some people experience your growth as a loss, not because you harmed them, but because the version of you they knew fit comfortably into their world. This is why self-awareness can sometimes feel lonely. Some relationships deepen as you grow, while others disappear. But losing a connection doesn't always mean you did something wrong. Sometimes the conditions holding that relationship together simply no longer exist. And those conditions can run deeper than we realize. People often move toward what feels familiar, not necessarily what is healthy. Someone who learned to earn affection may feel uncomfortable receiving love freely, while someone accustomed to emotional unpredictability may mistake instability for excitement. But once you start recognizing these patterns in others, another danger appears. You begin noticing who needs control, admiration, attention, or constant validation. And for a while, this can feel like psychological clarity. You may even begin believing you've figured people out. But Jung's work wasn't simply about discovering what is hidden inside everyone else. It was also about discovering what is hidden inside you. And that is much harder. It's easy to recognize manipulation when someone uses guilt against you. It's harder to notice when you become distant because you secretly want someone to chase you. You may claim not to care what someone thinks, while still checking whether they noticed your absence. You may tell yourself you're protecting your peace when part of you is actually using silence as punishment. Suddenly, the distance between you and the people you've been analyzing becomes much smaller. This is where the shadow becomes personal. The shadow contains the qualities that don't fit the image you have of yourself. If you see yourself as generous, admitting selfishness becomes difficult. If you identify with being strong, acknowledging neediness can feel threatening. If you believe you're kind, recognizing your own capacity for cruelty becomes uncomfortable. So the mind pushes these qualities away. But denying them doesn't remove their influence. You can deny jealousy while letting it affect how you treat someone. Deny your need for control while resenting another person's independence. Or deny anger while expressing it through distance and subtle punishment. For Jung, confronting the shadow wasn't about becoming fascinated with darkness. It was about becoming responsible for what already exists within you. Because what you can acknowledge, you can examine. What you refuse to acknowledge can continue controlling you without your awareness. Eventually, the same vision you use to see through other people's masks turns back toward you. And the question is no longer only, who are they when the mask comes off? It becomes something much harder. Who am I when mine does? Once you begin recognizing your own shadow, the way you judge other people starts to change. You become more careful with labels like good person and bad person because you begin to understand how contradictory human beings can be. Someone can genuinely love you and still hurt you. A loyal person can betray under the right pressure, and someone who considers themselves honest can still lie when the truth threatens the image they have of themselves. The same contradiction exists inside you. Under fear, rejection, humiliation, loneliness, or the desire to be accepted, people can behave in ways they once believed they never would. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does make human nature far more complicated than dividing the world into innocent people and villains. And perhaps this is one of the most important things Jung was trying to show. Awareness doesn't make the shadow disappear. It simply allows you to recognize it before it quietly makes decisions for you. You begin catching yourself in small moments. wanting to withdraw affection because someone disappointed you, feeling satisfaction when a person you envy fails, exaggerating your indifference because admitting that you care would make you vulnerable, or wanting someone to regret losing you because rejection wounded your pride. These moments can be uncomfortable, but they are also useful. Because once an impulse becomes visible, you no longer have to automatically obey it. You can feel jealousy without turning it into resentment. You can feel rejected without trying to punish the person who rejected you. That is the difference between having a shadow and being unconsciously controlled by it. But many people never reach this point because looking outward is much easier than looking inward. It is easier to study why someone betrayed you than to ask why you ignored the signs for so long. It is easier to say that you repeatedly meet emotionally unavailable people than to wonder why emotional unavailability feels so familiar to you. This is where another layer of the illusion begins to fall apart. We like to believe that our relationships happen almost accidentally, that certain people simply enter our lives and we either get lucky or unlucky. But attraction is not always random. Sometimes what feels immediately familiar or intensely exciting is connected to something much older inside us. A person who spent years trying to earn affection may later become deeply attracted to people whose affection also has to be earned. The conscious mind says, "Why does this keep happening to me?" But another part of the mind may be returning to something it already knows. This doesn't mean people deliberately choose painful relationships. Most of these patterns operate beneath conscious awareness, which is exactly why they can repeat for years without being recognized. You change the person, but somehow the emotional experience remains familiar. Different face, different circumstances, yet the same anxiety, the same chasing, the same disappointment, and eventually, the same ending. At some point, blaming every person who enters your life stops being enough. You have to become curious about the part of yourself that keeps opening the door to the same dynamic. And that question can be painful because it introduces responsibility where there was once only blame. But responsibility is not the same as blaming yourself for what other people did. It simply means recognizing what belongs to you, what you tolerated, what you ignored, what you idealized, and what you kept returning to even after reality had already shown you what it was. This is why becoming aware can change your relationships so dramatically. You stop trying to convince unavailable people to choose you. You stop believing that suffering for someone proves the depth of your love. And slowly, the people who once fascinated you may stop having the same effect. Not because they changed, because the part of you that needed that particular story is beginning to change. And this is where real psychological growth becomes visible. Not when you become better at identifying everyone else's problems, but when the patterns that once controlled your choices begin losing their power over you. As these old patterns begin losing their power, something unexpected happens. You become less surprised by people. You no longer expect someone to behave according to the version of them you created in your mind. Instead, you allow their actions to gradually show you who they are. This doesn't mean becoming suspicious of everyone or searching for hidden motives behind every kind gesture. That would simply replace one illusion with another. Naivety says everyone can be trusted. Cynicism says no one can be trusted. Neither one sees people clearly. Real awareness exists somewhere between the two. You begin understanding that a person can care about you and still carry insecurity, jealousy, selfishness, or fear. Someone can have good intentions and still behave badly. People can be sincere in one moment and act from ego in another, because human beings are rarely as psychologically consistent as we imagine them to be. Once you accept this, you stop demanding perfection from people before allowing yourself to trust them. Instead, you pay attention to what they do with their imperfections. Can they admit when they were wrong, or must every mistake become someone else's fault? Can they hear something uncomfortable without immediately attacking the person who said it? When jealousy appears, can they recognize it, or does it quietly become criticism and resentment? These things tell you far more about someone's character than the polished version they present when everything is going well. And the same standard has to apply to you. Self-awareness doesn't mean becoming a person without insecurity, ego, anger, or the desire for approval. It means becoming someone who can recognize those feelings without automatically turning them into behavior that harms other people. This is what prevents awareness from becoming coldness, because there is a danger in seeing too much human contradiction. After betrayal, disappointment, and enough experience with manipulation, it can become tempting to protect yourself by expecting the worst from everyone. You start interpreting kindness as strategy, affection as dependency, and vulnerability as another possible weapon. For a while, this can feel like wisdom because nothing surprises you anymore. But expecting betrayal everywhere is not clarity. It is still fear deciding what you see. Jung's ideas were never meant to lead toward isolation or contempt for human nature. Seeing the shadow was meant to create a more complete understanding of it. You can recognize someone's capacity to hurt you without assuming they inevitably will. You can notice warning signs without inventing ones that aren't there. And perhaps most importantly, you can leave when reality repeatedly contradicts what you hoped the relationship would become. There is freedom in that. You no longer need to turn someone into a monster before deciding they are unhealthy for you. Sometimes two people simply bring out patterns in each other that neither should continue feeding. Sometimes someone isn't evil, and they still shouldn't have access to you. This kind of clarity makes trust slower, but it can also make trust much deeper. Because now, when you choose someone, you are not choosing an imagined version of them. You are choosing the person you have actually observed. Their strengths, their contradictions, their limitations, and the way they behave when life stops making it easy to be good. And at the same time, you stop demanding that another person complete something inside you. You become less desperate to be chosen, less willing to ignore your intuition to avoid loneliness. You begin understanding that solitude is not always the absence of connection. Sometimes it is the space where you finally learn the difference between needing someone and genuinely choosing them. And once you learn that difference, relationships stop being places where you escape yourself. They become places where two imperfect people can meet without needing either one to become a fantasy. And perhaps this is where the entire journey leads. The goal was never to become someone who trusts nobody, expects betrayal, or searches for darkness behind every smile. It was never about becoming emotionally distant enough that no one could disappoint you again. It was about learning to see without constantly editing reality. When you stop romanticizing people, you stop asking them to become the characters your hopes created for them. You allow them to be complicated, inconsistent, imperfect human beings. And then you decide whether the reality of who they are belongs in your life. That difference matters. Because many of our deepest disappointments begin long before another person hurts us. They begin when desire quietly becomes interpretation. You want someone to be loyal, so you interpret closeness as loyalty. You want a relationship to work, so you treat potential as evidence. And eventually, reality catches up. The painful part is that reality usually leaves clues long before the illusion completely collapses. There were moments that made you uncomfortable, small inconsistencies you noticed and quickly dismissed, questions you avoided asking because you weren't sure you wanted the answer. Looking back, you may realize that your intuition wasn't always silent. Sometimes you were simply louder. But maturity is not punishing yourself for what you failed to see before. It is becoming willing to see it now. You learn to let someone's behavior speak before your imagination speaks for them. You stop turning attention into commitment, chemistry into compatibility, apologies into change, or words into character before time has given you enough evidence. And slowly, your relationship with trust changes. You may trust more carefully, but when you do trust, it comes from observation rather than desperation. You become less impressed by charm and more interested in consistency. You stop needing constant attention to feel valuable, and you become less willing to betray your own instincts simply to keep someone close. Most importantly, You stop pretending that you stand outside the problem. You remember that you also project. You also carry a shadow. You also have moments when fear changes your behavior, when ego protects itself, and when you would rather believe a comfortable explanation than confront an uncomfortable truth. That awareness creates humility. Because once you recognize the contradictions inside yourself, the contradictions in other people stop feeling so mysterious. You no longer need everyone to be completely good before you can love them. And you no longer need someone to be completely bad before you allow yourself to walk away. You can understand someone and still set a boundary. You can forgive someone without trusting them again. You can love someone and still recognize that loving them does not make the relationship healthy. And you can be disappointed in someone without rewriting every good memory as a lie. People are more complicated than that. They can be generous and selfish, courageous and afraid, loving and destructive, sometimes within the same relationship. Perhaps the mistake was never believing that goodness existed. The mistake was believing that goodness was the whole person. Jung's work points towards something much more difficult than simply exposing the masks of others, becoming conscious enough to recognize the whole human being underneath them, including the parts we would rather not see. And that includes the person looking back at you in the mirror. So maybe the day you stop romanticizing people isn't the day you become colder. Maybe it's the day you finally stop asking reality to protect your fantasies. You stop loving potential more than behavior. You stop confusing what someone could become with who they repeatedly choose to be. And you stop abandoning what you can clearly see simply because the truth threatens what you hoped would happen. There is something strangely peaceful about reaching that point. You don't need to understand every hidden motive. You don't need to predict every betrayal. And you don't need to become impossible to deceive. You simply become less willing to deceive yourself. Because perhaps the greatest danger was never that another person could wear a convincing mask. It was that your own loneliness, hope, attraction, fear, or desire could help you paint the rest of it. And once you understand that, people stop feeling like heroes who must save you or villains who suddenly betrayed the story. They become human. And so do you.